What if love wasn't a feeling, but a transaction? What if falling in love meant falling into a trap you couldn't escape? In the medieval world, you didn't choose who to love. You were chosen, traded, or claimed. No roses. No glances across the ballroom. Just silence and signatures. Tonight on Bedtime Tales, we unravel the fantasy and step into a time where love meant duty and disobedience meant ruin. So ask yourself, if you lived then not as the dreamer, but as the pawn, would your heart have survived? Because this story doesn't begin with a kiss. Rather, it begins with a bargain. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't about affection. It wasn't even about you. It was politics. It was land. It was bloodlines. And if you were lucky, it came with silence. If you weren't, it came with fear. To be born a daughter in a noble household was to be born a piece of strategy. Before you were old enough to speak in full sentences, your future may have already been sealed by men gathered around a long oak table. A name was mentioned. A deal was struck. Your fate, folded between wax seals and whispered promises, was no longer yours. They called it marriage. But it wasn't about hearts. It was about what your body could produce and what your name could secure. Some girls were betrothed by the age of 7. Many were wed by 12 or 13. The men they were given to could be double or triple their age, veterans of war, holders of land, or simply sons of more powerful fathers. When a young bride walked toward the altar, she was not walking into a union of souls. She was fulfilling a contract, one that had nothing to do with her dreams and everything to do with her value. The ceremony might have been dressed in lace and prayer, but beneath the surface it was an agreement, one that exchanged innocence for advantage. Her family would gain protection, influence, or territory. The groom's family might gain heirs, dowries, or royal favor. The girl herself? She would gain a new name and a life she had no say in. These were not stories of villains. They were simply the rules of the world. Marriage was expected. Virginity was a currency. Love, as we know it today, was not required. On the rare occasion a couple grew fond of each other, it was considered a blessing. But no one waited for it. No one depended on it. Nobility had duties to the bloodline. And if the heart interfered, it was to be ignored. Feelings, after all, could compromise the plan. The peasants lived differently, but not freely. For them, marriage was tied to survival. A union meant more hands for the field, more bodies to tend animals, more warmth in winter. Unlike the nobility, peasants might marry someone they knew. A neighbor, a friend, a childhood companion. But affection wasn't guaranteed. It didn't need to be. Most marriages were practical. Emotional connection came second, if at all. Days were long and exhausting. Life expectancy was short. The idea of marrying for love felt distant, almost indulgent. There were no grand proposals or courtship dances in the moonlight. There were promises exchanged by firelight over bread and broth, while the rain tapped against the roof. This wasn't the stuff of ballads. It was the stuff of getting through another year. And yet, even in this world where love wasn't part of the equation, the longing for it still lived. You could see it in the way some women stared out of windows when no one was watching. in the half-smiles shared at the market, in songs passed down, stories told in whispers. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. The quiet, aching question, could there be more than this? Could there be a love not bound by arrangement or survival? A love not measured by dowries or duty, but by something else entirely? That longing didn't die. It transformed. It became art, poetry, music, and eventually it became a fantasy so powerful that it would reshape our idea of romance for centuries to come. That fantasy was known as courtly love, a secret longing wrapped in ritual, a devotion so elevated it was considered dangerous, a knight loving a woman he could never have. It wasn't real love, not the kind that married couples lived. It was a performance, a dream made flesh in poetry and song. But for a people starved of choice, it was something. The idea that love could exist outside of marriage, outside of expectation, was a rebellion of the soul. In hushed gardens and candlelit halls, it fluttered between the lines of duty. It spoke in glances too long to be innocent, in verses etched into worn parchment, in tokens hidden beneath armor. This love, unspoken, unattainable, and often imagined, wasn't meant to be fulfilled. It was meant to ache, and in that ache, entire legends were born. The knight who loved a married lady from afar. The poet who wrote of a gaze never returned. The servant who cherished the silk ribbon of a woman he could never touch. These were not love stories meant for happy endings. They were designed to linger. Courtly love was never about consummation, it was about longing. And that longing had rules. A knight might pledge loyalty to a noblewoman, even if she belonged to another man. He would compose songs in her honor, risk his life for her name, and ask for nothing in return. In some cases, he was never even allowed to speak to her. His role was to suffer beautifully. The woman, in turn, was expected to remain unattainable, elevated, distant, untouchable. It was theater, written in the language of desire, framed by impossibility. A love that existed only in the mind was safer than one that dared to live in the world. But not everyone kept to the script. Sometimes, a glance turned into a conversation. A token passed in secret became something more. And when fantasy threatened to become real, the danger became very real too. For a woman of status, being accused of impropriety, even a smile misread, could mean disgrace. A man could lose land, title, or worse, if his intentions toward the wrong woman became known. One well-placed rumor could undo an entire lineage. So courtly love danced on the edge of a blade. It allowed people to dream without acting, to imagine without consequence, so long as they never crossed the invisible line. It was both a release and a prison, a celebration of emotion in a world that punished feeling. And perhaps that's why it captivated the medieval imagination. Because for those who had no choice in marriage, no freedom in desire, this invented version of love was the only kind they could safely hold. You could see it in the literature of the time. The ballads, the verses, the ornate letters. A night describing the way her voice made the air feel different. A lady writing of a dream where she danced in his arms, though she'd never spoken his name aloud. These words weren't written to woo. They were written to survive the silence. Because beneath the performance, the longing was real. And in a world where love was forbidden or forced, longing was all many people had. That ache carved itself into the culture. It became the language of desire for centuries. And even now, when we think of medieval romance, it's not the quiet wedding in the chapel we imagine. It's the aching eyes across the banquet hall. The stolen touch. The poetry that was never meant to be read aloud. But if courtly love was fantasy, real women still lived real lives, bound not by myth, but by the sharp edges of law, morality, and fear. While men were allowed to admire from afar, women had to remain still. Honor wasn't just expected, it was policed. One rumor, one misstep, one whisper in the wrong ear could change everything. A woman could be exiled from her home, removed from her children, shamed in public. Her worth, her entire social standing, was measured by a concept so fragile it could be broken by a glance. And while men might compose verses of undying loyalty, women had little room to respond. Their silence wasn't a choice. It was survival. In that silence, the illusion of courtly love continued to thrive, protected by its distance, its impossibility, its careful, cultivated pain. But beyond the poetry, the quiet suffering was very real. Because for women, even the illusion came with a cost. And behind those illusions, behind the music and the masks, real lives were being lived. Real marriages were being endured. And those women, noble or not, had very little control over what happened to their bodies, their names, or their hearts. Courtly love may have offered a dream, but reality came with laws, with rules, with consequences. And in that reality, being a woman in love, or simply suspected of it, could become a dangerous thing. Dangerous and very lonely. To be a woman in the medieval world was to live under watchful eyes. Not just the eyes of family or neighbors, but of society itself, church, court, community, each ready to measure her worth by how still she remained. Purity was currency, obedience a virtue, and silence was often survival. A woman was expected to be modest, devout, and dutiful. Her gaze too bold could be mistaken for invitation. Her laughter too loud for rebellion. A whispered conversation, a misinterpreted smile, even a moment alone in the wrong place. Each one could be spun into a story. And in a world where stories became evidence, innocence was fragile. If her name was tarnished, even by rumor, she could be cast out, regardless of truth. Her choices, what few she had, could vanish overnight. But even with so many rules, there was no uniform life. A noblewoman lived differently than a farmer's daughter, but both lived within walls they didn't build. A noblewoman might have riches and gowns and servants, but none of it belonged to her. Her lands were her husband's. Her children, his legacy. Her body is his right. The marriage contract made it clear. Her duty was to bear heirs, manage the household, remain faithful and unquestioning. She was often educated enough to read scripture, to host dignitaries, to recite poetry, but not to govern her own life. And if her husband died, she could become a widow at 20, suddenly powerful on paper, but vulnerable in practice. A wealthy widow was a prize to be claimed by another man or many. She could be married off again without consent. She could lose her holdings in a legal loophole. She could simply disappear into someone else's story. For peasant women, the challenges were different, but no less consuming. They worked alongside their husbands, parents, or siblings, tilling fields, raising livestock, grinding grain. There was no leisurely embroidery in castle towers. There were raw hands, aching backs, and long days that began before sunrise and ended in darkness. Marriage offered no escape. In many cases, it added another layer of labor. A woman might birth 10 children, bury half, survive illness, hunger, war, and do so quietly, without recognition. And if love did bloom in such a life, it bloomed quietly. Not in letters, not in songs, but in small moments. A hand held under the table, a word spoken after the others had gone to bed. There was no grand confession, just survival softened by care. But even the smallest deviation from what was expected could be dangerous. If a woman was suspected of adultery, even falsely, her reputation could collapse. In some towns, punishment came in the form of public shaming. In others, it came with stone walls and barred windows. For noble women, the stakes were political. An affair could end in annulment, exile, or execution. For common women, there was rarely a trial. There was silence, or scorn, sometimes violence. The law did little to protect her. In many places, it served only to remind her of her place. And yet, not all women remained silent. Some found quiet ways to resist. They left notes where no one would find them. They passed whispered messages between servants. They etched names into wood where only the moonlight could see. Some women read the same poetry men did, and saw themselves not as the distant muse, but as the writer. A few powerful women, queens, abbesses, heiresses, bent the rules. Some even rewrote them. But they were exceptions, not the rule. And their freedom came with cost. A woman who stepped outside the lines was rarely celebrated. More often she was feared or forgotten. In time, the pressure of living unseen found its way into stories. Women in tales were either saints or sinners, wives or witches, angels or betrayers. There was rarely a space between. The idea that a woman could simply be complex, curious, desiring, was too dangerous for most storytellers to name. So instead, they were written as symbols. And slowly, over generations, the real women, the ones who had hoped, longed, and endured, faded into fiction. Their voices buried, their stories half told, and those left behind were made to wear the silence like a second skin. But even silence leaves a trace. And even in the places where no one thought to look, beneath wedding veils, inside kitchen walls, within forgotten prayers, there lived the quiet, persistent truth that women loved deeply, that they dreamed even when forbidden, that they endured more than they were ever allowed to speak aloud. And when love did arrive, if it did, it was not always a salvation. Often, it was another burden, a dangerous one that had to be hidden in corners, buried beneath duty, or carried in secret year after aching year. Sometimes it never even found words. A stolen glance at a harvest gathering, a brief touch beneath the candlelight during an evening prayer, a faint smile exchanged in the presence of 100 others who never noticed. And yet, to the two caught in it, those moments were galaxies. Little bursts of something real, in a world that demanded silence. For the peasant girl tending herbs behind the manor wall, or the blacksmith's son delivering shoes to the steward's house, love was not something to be pursued, it was something to be protected. Because to be caught meant more than shame. It could mean losing one's livelihood, one's home, even one's life. So they hid, in woods where lanterns didn't reach, in gaps between feast days, in letters folded so small they fit beneath a sleeve. Sometimes, the only proof that love had existed at all was a dried flower pressed between the pages of a prayer book, or a name scratched lightly into the beams of a stable, fading slowly with the years. Even nobles, who had wealth and walls and wine to dull their truths, felt this quiet exile. The lady of the castle could not love the traveling minstrel. The heir of a kingdom could not wed the one who shared his dreams by firelight. Their marriages were sealed by treaty and tribute. Their lives carved into obligation long before their hearts knew what it meant to want. So love found other places to bloom, between lines of poetry exchanged under coats of arms, or whispered in song when it could not be spoken. And even then, there was always the risk of eyes watching, of duty interrupting, of scandal destroying. But still, the heart doesn't ask permission. It beats. It burns. It remembers. Even when the world tries to make it forget. Some lovers disappeared into history, unnamed and unmourned. Others became myths, remembered not for their romance, but for the tragedy it birthed, an affair punished too harshly, a secret unveiled too soon. But somewhere in that silence, in all that danger, love endured. Not the grand kind, the kind that survived because it had no choice. And as the centuries turned, even as castles crumbled and kingdoms fell, that kind of love, raw, quiet, hidden, left its mark. Not in the records kept by kings, but in the corners of song, in the margins of books, in the hush that falls when someone remembers what it means to want and not to have. And though the world around them gave little permission, still they hoped. And sometimes hope was all there was. But even the quietest hope, left undisturbed long enough, begins to take root. In the shadowed halls of stone manors, beneath the stained glass of flickering candlelight, behind veils of lace and silence, something began to shift. Not in bold declarations, not in grand rebellions, but in questions. Soft ones, dangerous ones. A daughter told her fate before she had even learned the shape of her own heart, whispered to herself, "Why must I belong to someone?" A young page, eyes lingering too long on the son of a visiting lord, felt something bloom in his chest that had no name, only warmth, confusion, and the ache of knowing it must be hidden. These moments were not chronicled in ink. No one wrote them into history books. But they happened. They passed in glances across supper tables, in the silence between verses of Mass, in the comfort of hands touching too long during the tying of a gown. Love, true, unarranged, unspoken, still lived here. Not because it was welcomed, but because it refused to die. In the gardens of keeps, women carved initials into the soft bark of ash trees, not of their betrothed, but of the stable boy who once brought them a flower without reason. In the low halls of servants' quarters, a loaf of bread left a little warmer than usual became a language. A folded scrap of cloth in a sleeve became a vow, unspoken but understood. Some found fleeting moments. Moments when the world didn't notice. Moments where no titles mattered. A kiss exchanged in a hayloft at dusk. A song hummed into someone else's silence. A name whispered when no one else was listening. Even the noble ladies, wrapped in silk and duty, felt the hunger. In the cold hours before dawn, they clutched letters not meant for their husbands. They reread lines from books they should have never seen. They traced the windowsill with fingers not in prayer, but in memory. And the men, those whose roles were written in blood and land, some of them, too, grew tired of the performance. Tired of pretending that power was enough. That honor replaced intimacy. That loyalty meant silence. They stood beside women they barely knew at altars heavy with gold, and wondered what it meant to vow something the heart didn't offer freely. And while none of this made them safe, love, when secret, is always close to peril. It made them real. No longer just titles and functions, but people, yearning, breaking, daring to imagine. In the dim naves of chapels, behind confessionals, in the echoes of hymns long forgotten, these small rebellions grew. Some women began to write, not chronicles of lineage, but poems of longing. Some men began to refuse, quietly, the hand they were told to take. Some simply waited, knowing that even in waiting, there was resistance. And in the waiting, they watched the old world grow uneasy. Because the whispers became murmurs. The murmurs turned into patterns. And patterns eventually form cracks. Even stone, if leaned on long enough, begins to shift. And still, they endured. Because even the faintest spark of love, in a world built to extinguish it, is a kind of defiance. And in those quiet acts, those unread letters, those stolen looks, those moments of trembling hands brushing in the dark, something remarkable was happening. Not loudly, not with the clang of swords or the ringing of rebellion, but like ivy creeping up the side of a castle, slow and unnoticed, until one day it wraps around every stone. There were no revolutions, no declarations, just people feeling. And that, in the medieval world, was more radical than we often remember. Because this was a time when even feeling the wrong thing could be perilous. A woman who looked too long at a man not her husband could find herself punished, locked away, accused of unchastity, made a warning to others. A man who wept openly over the loss of someone dear was told he lacked valor, that tears were for the weak, that emotion was shame. But still they wept, still they looked. And in that looking, in that weeping, in that longing that had no place in parchment or pulpit, they began to write a different kind of love story. One where the heart didn't ask for permission. One where it slipped through the cracks of arranged vows and bloodline charts. In villages far from court, the stories were different still. Their love sometimes danced more freely, though never without risk. A milkmaid might fall for a blacksmith's apprentice, their bonds sealed by daily glances and the rhythm of shared labor. Their hearts beat to the same sounds, the clatter of hooves, the hiss of heated iron, the low chant of evening prayers. They had no scrolls bearing family names, no alliances forged in coin. Just time, just repetition, just the quiet certainty that someone sees you not for what you offer, but for who you are. These loves, too, were often tested. A poor girl caught in the barn with a boy was seldom forgiven. Her body became a story told by others, a caution, a shame, a rumor whispered in markets and behind church pews. Yet still they met. Still, flowers were pressed into hands. Still, eyes searched for each other across gatherings, across chores, across seasons. Because even if love did not belong to them in law, it lived in them. And then there were those who loved where love was forbidden entirely. A knight who found himself thinking more about his fellow squire than the lady he was sworn to protect. A nun whose dreams were filled not with angels, but with the scent of the herbalist who passed by the convent gates. These were not the stories told aloud. These were buried, deep and quiet, like treasures hidden beneath floorboards. But the human soul, however constrained, finds ways to carry what matters. Even if it cannot speak, it remembers. It dreams. And dreams have always been subversive, because in dreams you are not a title, not a role, not a vessel of duty. You are yourself. You can run through woods without guards. You can kiss without fear. You can hold someone's hand without the world watching. And so love survived, through dreams, through songs sung in the fields, through lullabies whispered to children in the dark. It slipped into lullabies and prayers, into carvings on chapel pews, into tiny embroidered symbols hidden in the corners of gowns. Symbols only two people would ever understand. An iris, a swan, a crescent moon turned inward, each stitch a secret, each note a risk, but worth it, because even if love couldn't change the world, it could witness it. It could make a soul less lonely, if only for a moment. It could turn a cold room warm. It could make a lifetime of silence feel like it meant something. And sometimes that was enough. And when it wasn't, when the ache grew too strong, when the walls of expectation pressed too tight around a beating heart, some did the unthinkable. They ran. Together, under cover of night, they fled the world they were born into. Lovers disguised as pilgrims. Sisters who called each other friends, to the world, and everything else in the safety of moonlight. Some made it. Some didn't. Some were caught and punished. Some simply vanished into forests, into monasteries, into villages where no one knew their names. But all of them shared the same truth, that love, even when impossible, called. And answering that call, even once, made life feel real. Not in the sense of comfort, or safety, or permanence, but in the way your breath catches when you hear your name spoken softly, or when fingers brush yours under the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. It made time stretch. It made the moment sacred. For those who dared to love in the medieval world, It wasn't about happily ever after. It was about ever at all. A moment stolen could feed a soul for years. A kiss behind a stable wall could become a lifetime's memory, revisited again and again in the quiet hours when the world had forgotten you. Because that world, it rarely remembered lovers. The bards sang of noble brides and valiant husbands, of lords winning fair maidens in tournaments, of queens whose grace tamed the fury of kings. But they did not sing of the servant girl who watched the mason's son from behind the bread ovens, or the widow who fell in love again, quietly, secretly, with a man 10 years her junior, and knew she must never speak of it. These were not stories meant for record, but they lived on, in the way a woman lingered too long in a garden where she'd once laughed, in the worn edge of a book a monk kept hidden under straw, its pages filled with poems never copied again, in the way an old man, near the end of his days, stared a little too long at the sunrise, as if looking for someone long gone. Love etched itself into places history didn't touch. It made a home in the silent glances across church aisles, in the single extra roll left by a baker, in the warmth of shared ale, passed between hands that never touched but somehow always found their way back to each other. And even when it failed, even when love was betrayed, or lost, or unreturned, it left a mark. The medieval world had no words for heartbreak like we do now. But it had saints for suffering. It had rituals for grief. It had silence, and silence in those days said everything. Because even when love was gone, the body remembered. The way footsteps sounded when they approached, the cadence of a laugh, the smell of wool on cold skin. Some learned to carry it quietly, tucked behind duty and faith. Others became fierce in their longing, writing poetry in the margins of prayer books, carving names into beams, naming their children after the ones they could not have. And some simply waited in convents, in kitchens, on farms, in castles, not hoping necessarily that love would return, but that someday someone would see what they had once felt and understand. And this, perhaps, is where the story lingers longest. Not in the acts of passion or even the tragedies, but in the endurance, in the fact that love survived, not because it was allowed, but because it refused to disappear. It wove itself into the most unexpected corners, into folk songs and herb lore, into lullabies that mothers sang without knowing who wrote the words, into fairy tales told to children about knights who vanished into the woods with no explanation, because, perhaps, they had finally followed their heart. It survived in memory, in echo, and eventually in change, because love, quiet as it was, pushed the world forward. It made people question. It made them defy just a little. It made them hope for something more. And over time, those hopes added up. What began as glances became gestures. Gestures became stories. Stories became ideas. Ideas that maybe love shouldn't be locked in towers or measured by bloodlines. Maybe it belonged to anyone brave enough to feel it. It would be centuries before that truth could bloom fully, before vows could be chosen freely and desire could be named without fear. But even in the darkest centuries, love was there, beneath the surface, waiting. Not for permission, not for approval, just for a moment, just for a look, just for a chance to exist. And sometimes that was all it needed. To breathe, to flicker, to remind someone, anyone, that they were still alive. So if you ever find yourself lying awake beneath the hush of stars, wondering if the love you carry has a place in the world, know that it does. It always has. Even when it was whispered through stone walls, hidden in folded letters, or lived only in dreams, it endured. And perhaps, just perhaps, in remembering those forgotten hearts, we remember something true about ourselves. Sleep now, dear soul. The stories will wait. And love, it never left.